It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you our featured guests today, Jason Reed and Bill Golder. I'll tell you a little bit about them. So Jason is president at Paradigm Learning. He's got 18 years of executive experience in B2B sales and marketing effectiveness. He's a longtime senior vice president of enterprise sales at Miller Heiman, and he's a subject matter expert in professional salesmanship. And so his expertise will be brought to bear in this webcast about business acumen. I also would like to welcome Bill Golder to the program. Bill earned his sales and marketing expertise as an executive for Fortune 500 companies and for premier consulting firms in the sales effectiveness arena. He's held senior sales and operations roles for Kinko's, which is now FedEx Office and Office Depot, and for the past 8 years was an executive for premier sales and marketing consulting firm, Miller Heiman and Bulldog Solutions. So Jason and Bill are going to be our featured guests today. They're going to have a very insightful discussion on why business acumen is now the single most important attribute that a professional seller can possess. But before we get started, we want to take a pulse of our attendees. So we're going to move to our first polling question. So HCI members, if you could take a moment and weigh in on this first polling question. Again, you can check all the buttons that apply. So we would like to know whether you train your salespeople in product and solution knowledge. Do you train your salespeople in sales skills and techniques? And do you provide your sales folks with general business acumen training? So obviously, when you onboard new sales professionals, a lot of times you're going to have to give them the tools that they need to be successful in their role. We'd like to know to what degree these three elements are a part of that training. So as we take a look at some of the results as they're coming in, it looks like it's somewhat varied across the board. We've got folks that are trained in product, solution, and knowledge, some of them in sales skills and techniques, and some of them with general business acumen training. So we'll leave this open for just a little bit and let the results come in. It's going to help us better understand sort of the direction that some of our informal conversation can take. So we just want to get an idea of where the folks on the call are currently directing their sales professionals when they are given the opportunity to be trained. So we'll leave this up for just a few more moments, but it looks like it's kind of a mixed bag. I think I'm sure a lot of you are clicking more than one box. I would imagine that it's not just one area that your sales folks are given training, that in many ways it's a little bit of both. And all three. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Jason. And Jason's going to help us set the table for this discussion. So with that, Jason, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And also want to say thanks to Bill Golder for joining us. And a special thanks, of course, to everyone out there who's participating. Absolutely appreciate the fact that many of you, because of the technical difficulty last week, stayed with us for an extra week and joined today. So again, I appreciate that. Before I jump into a couple of slides and get started here, I do want to make a few points. First, I want to underscore something that Andrew said, and that is related to the time for this webinar. Bill and I do plan on going at a pretty fast clip. I suspect at the bottom of the hour, in roughly 30 minutes, we will be done with our sort of presentation part of it and slide right into what I expect to be a pretty rich Q&A session for 10 to 15 minutes. In other words, there's some good news. And the good news is we plan on giving you back, everybody on this call, a few minutes in your day. And then secondly, I think the good news is the subject matter. Frankly, we're talking about business acumen as it relates to professional sellers, and it is probably as hot a topic in the sort of sales enablement, sales effectiveness world as there is right now. And I think between how rich the subject matter is and our intent to go pretty quick, I'm guessing that many of you are smiling right now at the idea that we're going to give you some time back. I know that generally speaking, I would like that as a participant. I also figured that since we're here and we are talking about business acumen, like I said, as it relates to sales, professional salesmanship, and the fact that the most of the folks on this call are in some form or fashion related to human resources, L&D, or organizational development. Certainly, there's some sales leadership on the call. Because of all that, I thought perhaps a good way to start things off and kind of level set might be to put up a basic sort of hypothetical circumstance that I think most of us on this call, especially given its HCI, are familiar with. And the hypothetical is just this. And I'm asking you to decide. A high-value Chicago-based territory is open. You have 2 solid candidates, and you must fill the position quickly. Candidate number 1 has high sales acumen, not so much on the business side of the equation. They're steeped in sales experience, tenacious, likely a good closer, great at follow-up, been in sales for a long time, and of course, allegedly are going to bring a Rolodex to the table that ends up paying off for your company as well. That's candidate number 1. An archetype, I think, that generally speaking, if you've been in sales for a while and made hires, makes some sense to you. Candidate number 2, much higher general business acumen, but not so much on the sales acumen side of the equation. This candidate perhaps is clearly grounded in a more solid understanding of how business works. They seem to be comfortable and confident to you in terms of discussing business in the broader sense. Certainly seem fluid, generally speaking, as it relates to financial literacy and the lexicon that goes with understanding business, but they do not have a Rolodex, and they perhaps have a finite amount, if any, pure selling experience. And I say, who do you hire? What choice do you make to fill this position? In my opinion, as late as 4 or 5 years ago, the answer to this question is pretty easy, and it's likely candidate number 1 that's steeped and grounded in some high-quality salesmanship. What I would submit and what we are going to make a case for today is that in today's marketplace, in today's buyer-driven world, the answer is not so obvious to a decision like this. In fact, I think more often than not, given how sophisticated the marketplace is becoming for all of us, regardless of what industry we're in, sales leaders are increasingly leaning towards hiring the second candidate, the one who seems to have the business savvy and acumen and perhaps is lighter on the sales side of the equation. And this is a big deal. I know it's a simple hypothetical I laid out, but to understand this reality, I think is to appreciate a sea change that's afoot in the world of B2B selling. I know for myself, many years of being an individual contributor and a seller, as well sales management, senior sales leadership. I've made a lot of hiring decisions and certainly made my share of mistakes. And I think I probably speak for Bill when I say that both of us generally have a point of view now, and it's been increasingly solidified in the last few years, that general business acumen is perhaps the most valuable attribute a professional seller can have. And we would not have said that 4 or 5 plus years ago. And I think it speaks to just how profound the changes are. The reason I wanted to make this point is because I wanted to underscore the fact that the old model for sales success no longer applies. And I know that can mean a lot of things, but it just frankly doesn't. There's been a sea change like I talked about. Generally speaking, I am going to bucket this change and the drivers behind it into 3 categories. First, this notion that there's been a power shift that has occurred inside of the buy and sell dynamic in recent years. This shift has profoundly impacted the selling profession. And of course, as you listen to me right now, you're certainly connecting the dots and understand that this is related primarily to the internet and the ubiquity of information and access to information. Then you layer on top of that the fact that social seems to be ever evolving, and you have a radically changed sort of selling environment for the professional seller with significant implications. And I think that sales organizations, sales operations, sales training that understands this profound change is in a position to thrive, and while others fall behind quickly. This topic alone, this idea that the information age and ubiquity of information has changed things forever. It could easily be an entire series of webcasts, but it's an interesting one. I know it's not novel. Most of the people on the call have thought about this and are forever facing these type of headwinds and trying to figure out how to get better and better from a selling standpoint. The second point here is a consequence of the first one, and that is buyers no longer rely on the salesperson to educate them on options, products and services, pricing, and so forth. In fact, they regularly know as much as we do, as much as a salesperson does, prior to us even engaging or meeting them. I know when I started in sales and until only a few years ago, it generally was the case that the salesperson to some degree was the keeper of some very high value, often important, good information. And they were also the ones who sort of gave out the information to customers and prospects on an as-needed basis. Well, that entire dynamic flipped on its head is no longer the case. As I pointed out, it is a buyers-driven marketplace, and the reason for that is a shift in power and discretion that's moved away from the professional seller to the buyer, and being cognizant of this and understanding the implications, we think is largely the name of the game. And then the final point here, buyers only want to do business with salespeople they believe understand their business. This is a fact and supported by countless amounts of recent research over and over again. We've cited one example from Forrester here, but it really comes down to sales folks separating themselves largely on one front, and that front is they're perceived by the customer or perceived by the prospect as someone who is appreciative of the realities of their business and the drivers behind it. So when I look at the third point here, buyers only want to do business with salespeople they believe understand their business. I think to myself that by definition, this means that marrying up high sales skills with business acumen has in a lot of ways become kind of the holy grail formula for a thriving A-player, successful, high-performing salesperson. And it's this formula, that or one side of this formula that we're going to talk about quite a bit here today.
Thank you, Jason. That's been an important context setter here for us today. But I would love to sort of kick off the discussion portion of this by sort of asking you and Bill a couple of questions. And let's start with probably the most fundamental, and let's get to the root of what we're talking about when we talk about business acumen. It's something that is bandied about here and there in lots of sort of business improvement and sales improvement circles, but I'd love to get your take on what does it really mean.
Yeah, sure. This is a great starting point for us, and you're right. It is bandied about, and it's somewhat used in broad terms. I think a good place to start is a reminder of what acumen is. And acumen, simply is domain expertise. So that could be in anything. We happen to be talking about domain expertise as it relates to business and how business works and operates. Certainly, a part of defining business acumen has to include some level of financial literacy. In other words, being at least fluent enough to competently have conversations around the basics of how money flows through an organization, the interdependencies of various functions, etc. Not to be confused with having a depth of financial understanding as maybe an analyst or a CFO type or an accountant might, but rather a solid foundation in understanding how business operates, I often like when it's described as having enough knowledge to really connect dots and understand the story behind the numbers. I think is a good way to characterize what business acumen is. And certainly it manifests itself in good judgment, quick decision making, and kind of general astuteness. And as it relates to sales folks, anyone that's been around top shelf sellers knows that oftentimes the distinguishing characteristic is they have a certain cachet of business, just general business expertise that ends up being the reason they perform so well. And I think, Bill, maybe you can add some more color and anecdote to that.
Sure. I think one thing is true is that I hear a lot of different perspectives on what business acumen means, and whether that's throughout my career or with my clients, we are often talking about, how do we find people with more business acumen? And fundamentally, for me, it just means that we have someone who understands how a particular business operates, and the way we see that show up in their day-to-day behavior and attributes are. Jason mentioned a couple of them. We see it in the way they make decisions. We see it in the way they set priorities. And I would say mostly where I see it show up is how they interact with not only just people inside the business they're operating in, but certainly people outside of the business. So they really have an appreciation for the context, for the environment in which the people they're doing business with are operating in. They really understand what the drivers are. I've worked with people who have these characteristics, and they weren't financial gurus, but they understood the core financial drivers. And probably most importantly, they were able to understand how many of the strategies and priorities inside of, whether it's inside of their own organization or with their customers, connect back to those financial drivers in ways that help them, personally contribute and bring value. And you see that both internally and externally when they're working with people. And I know I've seen that in people I've worked with. If I were to put just a simple bow or a statement around business acumen, I'd say it's the ability to understand the greater context for what's happening and why within the operations of a business, and how that affects the way strategies are developed and decisions are made. And that's what I look for when I try to find people who have business acumen, or I'm trying to size it up to see if they have it. I'm looking for those kinds of things.
Yeah, some great points. And then before we move on, Andrew, I would like to at least put a visual up that is intended to point out that we're talking about business acumen, and it's not to be confused with selling acumen. There is an absolute distinction, and I think that, again, historically, sales acumen was more or less the rubric for a successful seller in the B2B selling world, and we've seen in a very short amount of time an accelerated change in terms of how you define what it takes to be a successful seller in today's marketplace. Certainly sales acumen and some of these attributes like tenacity and being a good persuader and being able to identify pain points and excellent follow-up and closing are valuable skills, but they're table stakes. Layered on top of that in today's world is a meaningful level of business acumen. We see more and more our clients and the sales leaderships inside of our client environments more and more recognizing the fact and also making a pretty clear distinction between these two and sort of being appreciative of the formula I talked about, which is you marry the two together and now you're where you need to be to thrive in today's marketplace.
So Jason, thank you for walking us through that. I'd like to get Bill's take on this next question. I think, you mentioned that business acumen is something that's always been important. It's certainly indicative of someone's sort of mastery of the subject matter. But why is it so much more important today than it has been in the past? So Bill, if you could weigh in on that, that would be much appreciated.
Sure. So Jason spoke to some of it in his setup, and I think where I might add a little color to that setup is when we talk about a sea change or how things have changed from a buyer perspective, there's a root cause behind all of that, and the root cause is technology. And if you even just think about the way we all personally make buying decisions today, whether that's shopping for a new car or being a part of a buying team in a corporate scenario, we use technology big time on the front end. So we're using technology to investigate options, explore what others are doing. We are grabbing an enormous amount of information online, and so that has essentially replaced the need in the early stage of the buying cycle, frankly, to have a dialogue with a human. We can get a lot of information and get ourselves really well educated before we make decisions. So that has huge implications to a salesperson who may very well be great at sales, all the attributes Jason talked about, high activity, and they know their products and solutions really well. They can ask, open-ended questions like, what's keeping you up at night? They may be great at all that kind of stuff, but now, because the buying community is so much more educated, all that's just not good enough. And so in this today more complex world, salespeople now, they need to come to the table actually knowing already what's keeping their prospects and their customers up at night. They have to bring a lot more value to that earlier conversation. They can't show up asking open-ended questions. They need to really be able to actually provide some insights for their clients and their customers. So when they connect early on, it's really clear that they can bring value to the relationship. So the things that they're doing, the folks with Business Acumen, the things they do well and why it's so important today is that they're already showing up, understanding what their prospects are losing sleep over, and they have an appreciation that prospect has consumed enough information, frankly, to teach the salesperson a few things about their own business. What they already have to know is they already have to know where the likely challenges and pain points are, so that they can start to think about what potential avenues or solutions or what best practices exist out there, and be prepared, frankly, to provide some points of view on how others are navigating some of these pain points and the opportunities that are out there. And you just can't do any of that by just being an expert in your solutions and great at executing a standard sales process. You have to understand the environment and the playing field that your prospect is in right now. A real good example. So I was talking to a prospect of mine who is in a sales enablement role in a large company, and she was describing how they just recently instituted a feature in their financial options for their customers, and were really excited about it. It was a differentiator for them. And they rolled it out to their sales team the way a lot of rollouts happen, which was a lot of great education around the offering and how the terms have changed and how that's different than other financial options out there. But what the salespeople didn't have, and this was straight from my prospect's mouth, was the context for how those financial options are important or not important, because sometimes they hit the nail on the head and sometimes they don't. And what the strategy lacked behind it was the strategy to give the salespeople or arm the salespeople with the context for how this new financial offering, financing option, was going to bring value to that customer. And without the acumen, they couldn't bring context, and they were getting themselves neck deep into conversations with financial people in their client environments that they simply couldn't navigate. And in fact, what ended up happening was it hurt their credibility, and it hurt actually the opportunity to differentiate because of the way that they came in and didn't really understand the context of their customer's environment. So it's clear to me when I see consistent, top-performing salespeople, their business acumen shows up throughout the sales process. It shows up on the front end. They understand the client's business. They understand where the pains and the opportunities are before they even show up at the office to have that first conversation, so they connect really well. It happens during the course of the sales process where they're able to connect the solutions they have to the pain points and the real drivers behind decisions inside their prospect environment. And then, just like the example I share, it shows up at the end when it's time to negotiate and it's time to make sure we've got the right financing options, and you understand, again, the context for the financial drivers and the strategic priorities. Those salespeople typically are helping their companies avoid price discounting and avoid challenges at the tail end of the sales cycle when we thought a deal was going to close, but it didn't. So that's why it's so important today. I think it's this. Jason talked about it as a sea change, and then that sea change has created all of these dynamics that show up at the start, the middle, and the end of the sales process.
Yeah, that's outstanding. I hadn't even heard Bill sort of compartmentalize it like that. I'm actually taking notes myself. The front, middle, and end of the sales process. And again, anybody who's been close to sales folks in action or carried a bag themselves is, I'm guessing, is tracking pretty closely to the story Bill just said, because it often is germane to each part of a sales process, and very often is the difference between winning and losing, I think. I wanted, before we move on, I did add this last bullet point called consultative selling, because in my world, when we are brought in, or even prospects are, pull us in to have a healthy conversation about how we may be able to help them, oftentimes in some fashion, their circumstance looks like this. They've invested heavily in training and support for their sales organization. In many cases, they've specifically gotten behind in a big way some kind of world-class selling process or selling methodology, some of the best in class, like a Miller Hyman or a Richardson or a Covey or Achieve Global or some other sort of proprietary selling process, all of which in some fashion drive home some universally acknowledged best practices of salesmanship, identifying all the buying influences inside of a opportunity during an opportunity pursuit, trying to go wider and deeper inside of an account, trying to move up to more senior levels. All of these undoubtedly virtuous things for any professional seller to strive for. These methodologies often provide great frameworks and utility in terms of reminding you how important it is to proceed accordingly. All of these methodologies also, in my mind, presume some level of business expertise and business savvy that is at least enough to be perceived as credible. So it sounds great, in other words, to say our sales folks need to become more consultative. They need to at least be considered a near consultant. And when they're good, they're very effective at speed to trust. In other words, whether it's on the phone or it's in a live meeting or a big presentation, for whatever reason, they are more effective than the others at gaining trust quickly, speed to trust. What we see is sales leaders, often very senior sales leaders, recognizing that this premise exists, and that assumes that their folks have the general business acumen to relate to customers in a way that has them perceived as credible. And they don't always. In fact, in many cases, they don't. Understanding your customer's business, being able to relate that, being able to demonstrate you understand the drivers behind their business, what they're up against. These are all things I would lump into one bucket as AKA business acumen. And it's this level of business acumen inside of a seller that begets credibility. And the credibility is required to be viewed as consultative. So it kind of plays out that way for us in the business I'm in, and it's interesting to watch it because it's become such a growth part of the equation for anyone who's in the business acumen business in recent years, and that is senior sales leadership wanting to get pretty serious about business acumen with their sales folks in order to complement the selling training that they've already indoctrinated. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Jason and Bill. I think that leads us to an opportunity to poll our attendees, and we've got our final poll question up now, and I'd love to get your take on this, HCI members. So let's find out, how would you evaluate your organization's current approach to improving business acumen for the sales team? We have several options. If you could select the one that best fits your individual situation. Option number 1, it's not on our radar at all. Option 2, we're just starting to discuss the importance of it and what to do about it. The third option, we've started to implement a learning and development strategy to address it. We have had an L&D strategy in place for some time, but it needs some improvement. And lastly, on the spectrum, we've had an L&D strategy in place for some time, and it's a world-class approach. So let's take a look at what the folks on the call are saying and how it all breaks down. So we'll leave this open for a little bit as the results start to trickle in. But it currently looks like a lot of the folks are saying that it's either in the beginning stages or it's sort of in the revamped version, or looking to sort of change up what they're currently doing. So luckily we don't have anybody that's saying it's not on our radar at all. That we kind of are falling within the sort of middle areas of the spectrum here, whether it's starting to implement a strategy, or we have one in place but it needs a little bit of improvement, or we're just starting to discuss the importance of it and what to do about it. So as these results come in, and I imagine they probably won't change too much, with the exception of maybe a few people who will fall on either end of the spectrum. Jason, what does this tell you about the current state of the workplace and how they're adjusting to sort of reinforce this business acumen training for sales professionals?
Yeah, my quick take looking at this, it's a bit surprising, to be honest with you, but it's also encouraging that C, represents the majority of folks on the call and where they're at in terms of a priority inside of their own company. What comes to mind is that had we done this, in my opinion, let's say a short 3, 4, 5 years ago, that it would likely look completely different. And I think that generally speaking, the sort of sales world, the sales enablement, sales effectiveness is on to the topic that we're talking about today, and it's reflective in what this survey says.
Absolutely. So I'll leave this open for just a few more minutes, and HCI members, if you haven't taken a moment, please do so and vote and have your voice heard. We'll move forward with the conversation, and Jason, I'd like to ask, what, in your opinion, are some methods that organizations could use to raise the level of business acumen across a sales force, or really any team? Doesn't necessarily have to be sales. I think HCI has been a big proponent of business acumen, in particular with some folks like the HR business partner role, that this is something that is a very important skill that can be translated across different functions and really can be leveraged throughout many different phases of an individual's career. So what are your thoughts on some methods that we can use to actually increase the level of business acumen?
Yeah, well, I think you make a great point that certainly it is relevant regardless of function. We happen to be talking about how it relates to the world of professional selling, but I think we all know that it's really smart and wise to think about your company and your folks in broader terms, and with the likes of them better understanding the business of their business. The drivers behind it, why decisions are made the way they are, et cetera, and then theoretically being able to go back into their roles and make smarter, wiser decisions that ultimately increase the company's performance. So certainly it's relevant to everyone. What I like about the way this question is worded is that it says raise the level. You can get caught into semantics when you talk about business acumen pretty easily. I and we do not view it as a thing. It's not like she has business acumen and he doesn't. It doesn't work like that. It is really a function of degree. What level of business acumen does the person have? What do they need to have? How can we increase the degree of business acumen inside of our broader sales organization in the next 6 months? So I think it's important to conceive of it the way this question does. And I think that certainly there's a lot of different ways that business acumen can be elevated. One, has to do on the front end in terms of as it relates to sales, hiring decisions. And what do you look for when you hire and you source for new sales folks to bring into your organization? Just how big a part of that sort of protocol and assessment is aimed at identifying the candidate's level of business acumen, if identified at all. So obviously some real smart can be applied to the front end of the onboarding hiring process. And then another, of course, would be business acumen related training. And it's as a general field, it's exploded in recent years, and I think that as it relates to business acumen for sales, that might be sort of the most dynamic piece of the space that we're in right now for the reasons we just talked about. So L&D organizations can work an acumen, business acumen strategy into their planning, which certainly happens every day, and we're talking to companies on a regular basis about doing that. And in some ways, it's being done in some really sophisticated, kind of slick ways that naturally augment and support the selling methodology or the core sales training that is, already underway. And then Bill's going to talk a little bit more about the middle bullet point here, and this is a good one, but it takes a little bit of brain power to kind of follow it, and that is, it's related to having a strategic focus on the ideal customer. What's the sweet spot? And to the extent you start putting a lot of effort around segmenting your sales organization's effort, in other words, focusing them in certain ways, it becomes increasingly important that those folks have a certain degree of business acumen related to the segment that they operate in. So I think it comes in a lot of different ways. I think it's a moving target, and it's something that you strive to just increase in a lot of ways incrementally. Bill, can you add to that?
Yeah, so I'll start with this idea of, what the strategy should look like. And I recognize that we probably have varying degrees of folks on the call, some of who could influence strategy, some who may not. That said, I think where I do a lot of work with my clients and where we get into this topic is often thinking about it from the perspective, the reason why we need business acumen is that we've made a strategic decision to really hunker in on where our solutions and our services can provide the most value and we can be the most differentiated. And companies who aren't thinking about that, frankly, are behind. So in this new world, you've got to think about how you take your products and services and solutions to bear in a customer-centric point of view. So the first thing I always kind of get to is you can serve the whole business acumen strategy for your sales team, first and foremost, by having a great strategy that's customer-centric, that's focused on the industries or the segments of your business in which you have the greatest opportunity to win and serve them well. When that strategy is locked down, then you think about it from that perspective, that aids the learning and development department to do the right things. They can focus on certain areas, certain industries and trends to bring into the curriculum and bring into a learning and development strategy that's very focused. It's very difficult to teach salespeople about every industry and every customer segment imaginable. In fact, it's impossible. So I'd say first and foremost is when you're going down this path, it's really important that it's connected to strategy. The second piece, Jason touched on this a little bit, which is business acumen is often bounced around as, is it teachable or is it not? In fact, I just wrote a post about it on LinkedIn, and it was interesting to see the commentary that came up behind it. And you had some people saying business acumen can't be taught. And there was a kind of a nice little debate that was happening amongst the commentary. And it's true, you can't deliver the business acumen in a nice little package, like Jason said. It's not just a thing. But I think the strategy has to be a strategy that combines, real learning events that teach tangible things around financial acumen and trends and realities inside of specific industries and realities around specific buyer types that your salespeople engage with every day. Those things can be taught, and then there has to be a coaching and development strategy behind it with sales management. So this is where learning and development, sales, and marketing, frankly, all have to collaborate on this effort, because it's a strategy. It's not just a curriculum. It's a strategy that says, we are going to deploy ourselves in a customer-centric way. We are going to start teaching our salespeople about the realities of their customer and their prospect environments. And we're going to make sure that our coaching strategy and our reinforcement and our tools and even our marketing collateral and sales enablement tools all revolve around how do we engage with customers from the lens of how do we help them solve their problems in their world and their environment. So the learning and development strategy around Business Acumen has to have this multifaceted collaboration between L&D, sales, and marketing, in my opinion. That's why it's hard. That's why I think, we saw what we saw in this poll question. Lastly, I think on that point, in terms of how training dollars are devoted, training dollars get chewed up quickly around product training and sales skills training. And while I certainly don't suggest you don't do those things, I do think that strategically sitting down and understanding how will we now devote our training dollars in three buckets, which is certainly we got to make sure people understand our products and what are the core sales skills they need. And then lastly, how are we going to teach them about the customer environments in which they serve? Thinking about your learning and development strategy in those three buckets and making sure there's resources and dollars and energy disposed against that third leg is critical.
Thank you so much, Bill and Jason. At this point, we're going to turn the presentation over to our members who can type in questions through the chat box, and we've got a few minutes remaining to take a couple of questions. So if you have yet to ask a question, HCI members, now is the appropriate time to do so. So let's get started with one of the first questions. I think this is an interesting one. It's a good way to sort of tee off the Q&A. So one of our members asks, what are the differences between business acumen and business strategy?
Bill?
So I think of business acumen as something that is resident in an individual, and certainly I think of business strategy as more organizational. I think when you think of strategy, we got to think about strategy from the perspective of how are we going to go to market? What are the customer segments that we're going to serve, and who are we going to go after, and how do we deploy our people, and what's our marketing plan? That's the business strategy. And then I think business acumen becomes an important component of how we execute against the strategy. So how are we going to engage with our customer segments in the right way? Well, we're going to engage with them in the right way, making sure that our salespeople are equipped to do that in a differentiated way and bring value at every stage of the sales cycle. And I think that's where business acumen fits in. It's a supporting player in a strategy to become customer centric. That's how I would answer that.
Right. I would add that in a sort of hypothetical situation where you've got folks with high levels of business acumen, they can use that skill to inform a business strategy, and vice versa. That in many ways it becomes a sort of a virtuous cycle that can help propel the business toward success and productivity. So. Another question that comes up, I think, is when you talk about onboarding new sales professionals, and in a lot of ways, sort of the old school manner of doing so was very much sink or swim. And I think to Jason's point that the sales enablement community has kind of seen the folly of that system. But I would ask if there are organizations that are, as indicated by our poll, looking to develop business acumen in sales professionals in a new way. When you talk about hiring and onboarding new sales professionals, what's a good sort of guideline for letting them get their sea legs, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I know at least for me, and Bill, you can add on to what I'm going to say, but I was talking about so you got one part of the equation is just literally how do you execute and handle your hiring and interview process. What does that look like, and does that account for trying to identify and size up business acumen prowess inside of prospective candidates before you make the decision to hire or not. I suspect in a lot of cases that's not really even, explicitly accounted for, and it probably should be. One of the sort of sink or swim, and at least from my vantage point, certainly still lives, especially in some industries. But I think it is a finite amount of industries and companies that can get away with that kind of sort of sales sustainment strategy that more so was the case in the past, but it just doesn't work in today's environment, and it puts a lot of pressure on being really smart about the people you do bring in, and then from that point, of course, doing what you all on this call do, which is help develop and support them appropriately for that ramp up. When we are partnered with companies that have us uniquely supporting their sales organization, we oftentimes live inside of both the sort of initial sales onboarding part of the curricula, as well as a more custom kind of sophisticated business acumen deliverables created for the established, more senior folks that might be specialized, like Bill was talking about. So I think there's a lot of ways to do it. It sort of starts with sales leadership being appreciative of what we're talking about here today, and that is, like I said, business acumen, begets credibility, and you must be viewed as credible if you're ever going to have a chance to be a consultative seller, which is so much the North Star for about every senior sales leader I know. Our folks need to become more consultative in nature. Our products and services are broader, they're more sophisticated, and it requires our customers to view us as consultative. And that's what I mean about all the stuff that sounds good, but in practical terms, there are implications if your folks don't have the prowess to come across accordingly.
That's a great point, Jason, and I think it's at this point that we can safely wrap up the content for today. But I want to thank our guests, Jason Reed and Bill Golder, for their time and effort in putting together this presentation, as well as the commentary and discussion points that we have gleaned from this program. With that, I will also extend a thank you to our sponsor, Paradigm Learning, for making this webcast possible. I'd be remiss, however, if I didn't extend the biggest thank you of all to each and every one of our HCI members who've taken the time to join us today on the webcast. We look forward to seeing you all on another webcast soon. Enjoy the remainder of the day, everyone. Let's make the most of it.